We're here to talk about the book that Jaap Penrod and I did together. My name's Hudson, and I wrote this book about a friend of mine. I was really surprised to hear one day I had the radio on. I had been working in my studio. I was about to leave for New York City, and there's an interview show on, a local radio station from Albany, New York. And the interviewer says, and today, ladies and gentlemen, we have our very own Schindler from our region on, Mr. Jaap Penrod. And I go, Jaap, what are you doing on the radio? Schindler, as you know, was a great hero of the Holocaust, a Holocaust rescuer. And so I think, what is Jaap, my friend, my buddy for 12 years, doing on the radio? And I start listening, and I hear this story about how, when he was a young man in Amsterdam, had rescued over 400 people from the Nazi Holocaust. The radio station had gotten word that he was receiving an award from an Israeli organization called Yad Vashem, who honors, among other things, non-Jewish people who helped to save the lives or rescue Jewish people during the time of the Holocaust. So that's how they knew about it. I started listening. I called my friends and said, everybody turn on your radio. Jaap's on the radio. It was a fascinating story that I heard about how he figured out this little scheme to get his Jewish friends out of Amsterdam, out of harm's way and on their path to freedom. What he did was more or less set up something of an underground railroad. I'm sure you all are familiar with the story of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad for getting slaves out of the South before the Civil War here in this country. Jaap did more or less the same thing to help get Jews out of Holland. So I was telling friends about it over dinner that night, and they said, well, you got to write a book about it. And I thought, well, you know, I'd like to, but it just doesn't, you know, it's so different from anything else I've ever written before. I've written stories about dinosaurs coming to New York and King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but it just seems so far afield from anything I had ever done before. It was far too serious and real, and it didn't feel like, you know, I was born after the war. It didn't feel like my history. But I realized that as long as I was thinking it's not my story, it's not my history, it wasn't that different than what people at the time were saying, which was, it's not my problem, it's their problem. And I realized that was something that Jaap was not saying. Jaap isn't Jewish, but he felt like he just couldn't stand by and see what was going on to the Jewish people, his Jewish friends, and even the people he didn't know. It was an injustice that he was not going to participate in. He felt like he had to do something about it. The main thing that I realized in studying the situation there in Amsterdam at the beginning of the war was that the Nazis were very good at making you feel helpless. They made everybody feel like a bunch of scared rabbits, kind of. In that way, they could sort of keep everybody under control. You know, if you feel powerless, then you're just going to do what the person in command tells you to do. And they were very good at that. They really did their job very well. Jaap didn't buy into that. He sort of felt like, you know, there must be something I could do, and I'll figure out how to do it. And so for me, I realized Jaap did what he could at the time, and it sort of inspired me to feel like, well, then I should do what I could. And that's to write a book about his story and share it with all of you, because as time moves on, more and more people who actually witnessed it and experienced the Holocaust and lived through it are gone now. They're disappearing every day, very quickly. And we need to get their stories while we still can. Otherwise, we're all left to the discretion of whoever would rewrite history in their favor. And there are many out there who would. So it's good that we all know now what really happened, what really went on from those who lived it, who went through it, who can still share it with us while they're still here. So that's what inspired me to do this book. The story goes like this. when Jaap, I'll start if you don't mind. I'll tell Jaap's story, and then he can take over at a certain point. The Nazis came into power, in the early 30s in Germany. By 1940, they were taking over Europe. The Blitzkrieg happened. They took over. The Blitzkrieg means lightning war. They were flying over one country after another, marching into it and taking it within a few days. So Holland fell within 8 days. And shortly after the Nazis were there, they started issuing ID cards to everyone. And everybody had to carry them, identification cards. The Jewish ID cards look like this. Same thing with a picture on it, except that there was a big black J stamped on the back of it. So obviously they were already starting to separate the Jewish Dutch citizens out from everyone else. So Jaap and his friends thought, well, let's try just, bleaching out the J. That didn't work because it left a big white blotch on it, on the ID card. So he thought, well, why don't I just try my hand at forging one? Now, that was a smart thing to do because Jaap had access to printer's inks. His father was a printer. He printed books. And so he also had experience at drafting because he was an architecture student. So he was very skilled with his hand at, making nice clean lines and good lettering. At the same time, his friend Kreen Taconis was a good photographer. So they got in the business of making fake ID cards. Now, this was important, you see, because at the time, if you were carrying an ID card with a big black J on the back of it, a Nazi could stop you on the street and card you and see the J and haul you in right there on the spot, and people wouldn't see you again. That happened. That happened with some frequency. So this was, a step toward trying to shelter people as long as they could. Anyway, it worked. They started making false papers for their Jewish friends with new IDs, new names that didn't sound like Jewish names, sort of Christianized names, new photographs. And for a good year and a half, it was very effective. Unfortunately, the Nazis kept moving in tighter and tighter around the Jewish community, isolating them from the rest of the Dutch population. Pretty soon, they put up barbed wire all around a Jewish part of town, making it into the Jewish ghetto, basically, and forcing all Jews from all over Holland to move into there, cramming everybody into this one tiny little part of town. And then by April of '42, everyone was forced to wear the yellow star, which I'm sure you've seen pictures of. Around that time is when they started taking people away to Germany on train loads. And nobody at that point really knew where they were going, but they had, pretty bad suspicions. There had been work camps, concentration camps set up as soon as the Nazis came to power in Germany, where people were essentially just worked to death. And so they thought that that was a possibility of where people were going. But of course, the Nazis weren't saying anything. In any case, there was a big scramble for hiding places. I'm sure you know the story of Anne Frank and her family. People were looking just to hide wherever they could. But hiding is a big logistical problem, you see. For, say, like a non-Jewish Dutch citizen to take on the responsibility of hiding somebody, it means that you've got to take care of their food and water and so forth into the foreseeable future. If they had any medical problems or whatever, you had to be the one to be the go-between. And they had to be totally still during the day because you couldn't trust the neighbors to make, if there was any noise or anything like that. You didn't know who to trust. You didn't know anything. So there was so many problems with hiding people, besides the fact that Amsterdam is a small town. There's not that many hiding places. And also Holland is a very flat country, so it's easy for people to be seen, you know, trying to cross the countryside. Now, a lot of people did go into hiding on the farms. That was a more typical place to hide people, away from the big metropolitan areas. But Jaap was a city boy. He didn't know that many people on farms. So his idea was to just try to get people out of danger, out of harm's way. And he came up with this plan that I thought I would read you. It's from this chapter here called A New Plan. Now, it starts when he's recovering from having spent 2 months in prison. The Nazis did bring him in under suspicion of helping his Jewish countrymen. They put him in the Bureau of Jewish Affairs and questioned him. Somebody had given them his name under suspicion that he was making ID cards. They questioned him. They put him in solitary confinement. They put him in a tiny little cell with 4 people and fed him, you know, like a piece of bread and you know, a bowl of water for a few months. But ultimately, they didn't really have anything on him and let him go. Now, they may have let him go because they didn't have anything on him, but also the Nazis were very whimsical. You never really knew what they were going to do, and every now and then they would let somebody go just to kind of throw everybody off balance. In any case, Jaap, by some great good fortune, did get out, and he was here at the beginning of this chapter. He's recovering, of course, from malnutrition. If you're on bread and water for 2 months, you're going to be suffering from malnutrition. And he's in bed when his friend Kreen is coming over to tell him what's been going on. So this is a chapter called A New Plan, and it's autumn of 1942, and it starts this way. Jaap, it's gotten worse since you've been gone, said Kreen. I didn't think that was possible, Jaap replied from his bed. He was still recovering from prison. It feels like a sinking ship, Kreen continued. Everybody's trying to cling to the end of the boat that's still sticking out of the water, but it's going down fast. The Nazis are taking everybody now. 5,000 in one night last week. 5,000 in one night. It was awful, Jaap. They were going house to house in my parents' neighborhood. We were out in the street in our pajamas, but there was nothing any of us could do. My dad tried to stop them from taking our neighbor, Mr. Meltzer, but he just got the butt of a rifle in his face. My mother put her coat around an old lady, but they just yanked it off. They even emptied out the Jewish nursing home down at the end of the street. What could they do with a bunch of old people? It was total madness. Kreen peered out the window. A Jewish family was being loaded into a truck while the Nazis lit cigarettes and laughed. He just shook his head and turned away. We can't hide 100,000 people. We're lucky if we can even hide ourselves. But what are we supposed to do? Just stand here and watch it happen? I've been working on a new idea, Jaap said. I heard about an underground group working with the Allies. They rescue downed British and American pilots and bring them to France. The French underground takes them across the Pyrenees to Spain, and then the Spanish get them down to Gibraltar, where they pick up a boat for England. Maybe we could set up our own line to get Jews out of here. How? Inquired Kreen. With false papers, said Jaap, just like the ones we've been making, just a different kind. I think I can get my hands on documents from a German construction company. I'll copy their letterhead and print it on blank paper so it looks very official. But then I'll write a letter on it saying that the company has hired us to bring workers to their job site in France. Then we use the letter to apply for an official travel permit. And this job site would be the Atlantic Wall, said Jaap. The Germans are building this huge wall all along the coast of Europe now, all the way down from Norway to Spain. I know about it, said Kreen, but is this company building it? Who knows? I don't even know if they exist anymore, said Jaap. It's just a chance we'll have to take. But the Nazis have over 500,000 people working on the wall right now. They want to make Europe into a gigantic fortress. There's no way that they can keep track of who's doing what and where. Kreen stood up. He paced back and forth and stopped suddenly. Why don't you just forge a travel permit? I don't have a real one to copy, said Jaap. Fake papers only work if they're identical to the real ones. If it's wrong, we're dead. That's a problem, said Crean. The important permits are issued only in Paris. Now Jaap was out of bed, also pacing back and forth. So, since we don't have a travel permit yet, we'll have to sneak to Paris to get one, right? I think so, said Crean. But one more thing, it also depends on having a good connection at the other end. Who do we know in Paris? Jean-Paul. He moved back at the beginning of the war, said Jaap. Oh, of course, he'll have contacts in the French underground. I better get dressed, said Jaap. We have work to do. The next day, Jaap visited an architect friend who had worked with the German construction company. He gave Jaap a few papers printed with the company logo. That night, Jaap sat to work, transferring the logo to blank paper using a small press and printer's inks in his father's print shop. The letter had to be written in perfect German, so they asked the help of a German friend who had fled the Nazi regime. With the false signature of the company director, the document was complete. Jaap blew on it to dry the ink and then laid it down in the center of the table. They stared at it for a long moment and then looked at each other. Well, there's step one, said Jaap. Now for step two. Right, answered Crean. Paris. So I'll move on to the next chapter, which is they're working their way to Paris. Jaap and Crean were silent all the way to Maastricht. There were just a few Nazis on board the little train they were now taking to the south end of Holland, but they were thinking about the next one. Since traveling to Paris without papers meant risking their lives in any case, they had decided that their best chance would be to hide in plain sight, riding among the Germans themselves. A German troop train would have no conductors, tickets, or border checks. There was one heading to France that made a stop in Maastricht at midnight. They planned to board it and do their best to blend into the crowd. The blue-gray dusk of the wintry afternoon had already settled over the medieval town when they stepped off the train. Nightfall in Maastricht, like all of Europe, was unbroken by a single light that could attract the Allied bombers. The two young men wandered the cobble streets until curfew time, 8 p.m. They took refuge in the men's room at the train station and waited. Shortly after midnight, a whistle pierced the stillness. With the screech of brakes, the station suddenly filled with German clatter. Jaap and Crean quickly adopted the frantic mood and pushed their way up the steps of the train. The car they entered was packed with a full array of the German military. As the train lurched forward, Jaap and Crean swayed with the masses of Nazis pressing against them. Luftwaffe, SS, Gestapo, security police, and every rank of the Wehrmacht were all in the mix of uniforms. But there were also many in plain clothes, giving the cover for Jaap and Crean's own lack of uniforms. During the night, the train slowed and stopped repeatedly as soldiers ran out and checked for bombs hidden under the tracks. How ironic, Jaap thought. Our biggest danger right now is from our own boys in the Belgian underground. 9 hours later, Jaap and Crean emerged at the station in Lille in northern France. They found their way to a bus heading for Paris, and within hours they were standing in Jean-Paul's apartment, gazing out at the Eiffel Tower while he prepared dinner for them. They were awake before dawn the next morning. The day had arrived when they would walk into the lion's den, the Nazi head office called a Proofstelle. Whether they walked out again with or without the papers rested entirely on something that old Mr. Mandelbaum called chutzpah, his word for guts. The Proofstelle was on the Champs-Élysées, the main street of Paris. It was the central clearing office for all permits and licenses in Western Europe under the Third Reich. They decided to wait till noon before entering the Proofstelle. Fewer people would be around, and those who were might be more focused on lunch than on their own jobs. If someone called the director of the construction company in Germany to verify Jaap and Crean's letter, perhaps he would be at lunch too. They knew there were 1,000 things that could go wrong. All they could do was try and minimize them and hope for the best. Jaap and Crean entered the vast marble hall. It was crowded with officials and military personnel. They found the shortest line. "Good day, miss," Jaap said to the young uniformed woman behind the counter. "I think you'll find our papers in order. We're here to obtain a—" "One moment, please," she said with her head down looking at their letter. She filled out a form and paper-clipped it to the letter, then set it aside. Your travel papers, please. But that's what we're here requesting, Yop said evenly. Ours as well as the group of workers we'll be leading. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Yes, of course, she finally said. Return to this window between 3 and 4 p.m. Will you still be here? Asked Yop. She nodded. Yop and Kreen tipped their hats and walked away. They both breathed deeply when they were outside again. So now they've got to go back there and see if they're going to give them their papers or if something else will be waiting for them. So I think at this point I'll turn it over to the man himself and let him continue the story.
Okay. We decided that it would be better if we went one after another, not the two together, because the danger is greater for two than for one. When it was my turn, I went into that hall again. I never saw the same woman again who helped us in the morning. But so I went to one of these lines. I told her what I was doing, why I was there. She went into the back, came back with a courier paper, a courier permit, Kurierschein in German, and which was a long paper, folded many times with all the information on it, which entitled me to bring workers, to bring people from one point in Europe to another point. In other words, I could use it to bring people from Holland to France. And with it, they gave us a whole stack of copies of permits. Actually, they were not permits, they were papers which the workers needed to fill out their name, their address, how old they were, where they lived, and which is the same as an address.
Sort of like blank forms, kind of.
Blank forms, and entitling them to food coupons, and that was very important because we took these things back to Holland as quickly as possible. These papers were needed, of course, to give each of the Jewish kids whom we brought to France a new identification. We gave them new names. And that is something which you will understand how difficult it is if you go for 16 or 17 years by the name of Isaac Mandelbaum, and all of a sudden you become Henk Grotenhuis. That is not only very difficult, but you have to be on your qui vive all the time, because the Germans had all these little tricks. When they saw people together, they would shout, "Hey, Isaac, come here." And if the real Isaac would happen to be so unfortunate to stand up, they would catch you, of course. This never happened, not because we indoctrinated them well enough, but they were fighting for their life. And in those cases, you are very careful and on your toes. Now we filled out these papers for about, I must say that they were very crude papers, because in those days they didn't have Xerox machines to make copies. They had a system called mimeography. You made a master on a kind of gelatin paper, and then in a drum you would rotate it, and out came kind of crude copies. But that was exactly what we wanted, because that looked real, of course. So it was easy for us to copy the papers which they gave us, because we needed hundreds of them. They were the power of these papers came from the fact that there were stamps on it. a German stamp was a circle, which I made, by the way. I had an old egg cup, which was the exact size of the real circle, so I used the egg cup.
Looks like this.
Yeah, right.
There's the stamp.
There's the stamp. And around, within the circle, it would show the people who had issued the permit. Depending upon what it was always a different name and a different town who issued the permits. And then in the middle there was this German eagle, and in the middle of the German eagle it had a swastika. And the Germans had so many papers, they didn't know whether they were coming or going. They didn't know what was real and unreal. If you showed them a paper with the stamps on it, they believed it to be true. We assembled about 20 people. I really don't know whether there were 19 or 20. I forget. But these were friends of friends. They were, if they were young enough, they were our friends, or sometimes they were the children of friends. And we issued them the proper names and papers, and now we were off to our first convoy, our first trip to Lille. And we were very, very lucky. It went without a hitch, no problem at all. When we got to Lille, not the first time, but on one of these trips, I remember we were very late arriving, because these trains took a long time. A trip which usually took 8 hours or so could take 24 hours or even longer, because besides the locomotive, behind the locomotive, they were steam locomotives, of course. They had a flat car with cannons on it and German soldiers, and in the back of the train the same thing. And when the British would come over and shoot at the train, those cannons would shoot back at the planes. And believe me, that's not a happy situation to be in. You're always...
Maybe you all have seen this illustration. This was a fun thing for me to do. If you can see, the German guns are down here on this flatbed car, and here the British Spitfires flying over, strafing the plane.
Often we had to leave the train, and the train stopped, of course, and then we had to leave and lay in the field in a ditch or so until it was safe again, and then we went further. In addition, there were the resistance workers in Belgium or in France trying to blow up the trains and to blow up the rails. They didn't know that we were aboard. They thought they were trying to sabotage a German train. And we did that about 20 times. No, not about, exactly 20 times. At one point in Amsterdam, we entered the compartment where we were supposed to be seated. You know, in the European trains are a little different. They have a long corridor and compartments on one side. And as we entered that one compartment where I was supposed to be seated with 6 others, there were German officers there, and they said they didn't want us. So I went to find the leader of the train. The Germans always had a leader for everything. So a train too had a leader. I found him, and I told him the story. I said, we are not wanted there, but this is very important that we bring these laborers to the Atlantic Wall. We are helping you winning the war. And he agreed to that. He thought it was a good argument. He went back, threw the Germans out.
Continue.
And now And now, all of a sudden, the Jews were being seated in a compartment, and the Germans were thrown out. I think that was the first time this must have happened. The Jews were being seated instead of Germans. This came to a halt because in April of 1944, it was about 5 weeks before the invasion of Normandy. When the Allied armies invaded Normandy, they had bombarded the northern France completely. There were no trains anymore, there were no stations, there was no rails, there was nothing. It was all gone. So that is why we stopped doing it. And all in all, we had brought 406 people, according to Black Jaap, who was the man who helped me finding the Jews, because I only knew so many. I only knew the people in the beginning, friends and friends of friends, but I ran out of people. But he knew how to find them and bring them to us. His name was Black Jaap because I was Blond Jaap, and that's all we knew of each other. You never knew who someone you worked with was. You didn't know his background. Not only didn't you know it, you didn't want to know it, because by giving the improper information to someone, you might not only endanger the situation, you might endanger his life too, because he should know more than you shouldn't burden him with information which he shouldn't have. After that, when being in Holland, I went into hiding myself, because now they were not after the Jews anymore, they were after any male between 16 and 65 was caught whenever they could lay their hands on you for slave labor in Germany. So I went into hiding in a small village with a doctor friend who had a barn next to his house, and that's where we survived the war. After the war, many of these people who had joined the Allied armies came back to Holland when they were stationed in Germany as an occupation army, and it was nice to meet them, that we've all made it through the war. I think that's the gist of my story.
Well, that's good. He ended up getting out at least 406 people that we know about, that's been documented through Yad Vashem, the people who awarded him the Medal for the Righteous Among Nations. And you've been living in the United States since 1958, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now we have some time for questions. Who will be the first? Yes, sir.
What was the closest that you've ever come to being caught by the Nazis?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to think about which day was more frightful than another, but I do know a situation where we were in a little town where the train stopped, and that little in the middle of Holland, and that train was so long and the station was so small that only a certain amount of wagons could stand in the station next to the platform, and all the rest was out in the field. I've seen it here happening too in little towns. Mm-hmm. The Germans had a trick then. This was in the middle of the winter, and it was very, very, not only cold, there was a terrible wind, it was snowing and hailing and very, very bad weather. They had us go out of the train, and they had us drop our pants. Now, why would they do that? in Europe, Jews were circumcised, non-Jews were not. So that was an identification which they could miss. And as we were doing that, it took some time, and I forget the details, but at one point they said, okay, back in the cars. I think they didn't want to get wet either, the policemen. And I think that was the closest we would get to disaster, because had they found out that they were Jews, they would have shot us right there on the spot. They didn't do anything. They didn't give you a fine, or they didn't take you to prison. They just shot you.
Mm. Yes.
Did you ever encounter any of the people you helped bring to freedom?
Yes.
After the war?
Yeah. Many came back, as I said earlier, who were civilians couldn't travel right after the war, but the ones who were in the armies, and in uniform, they could travel. They had jeeps, and they were stationed in Germany then, and they came to Holland, their country of origin, when they had a day off or a couple of days off. And I saw many of them. I saw, but then after we left for America in '58, it petered out. I don't think that people could find me, because you don't leave an address. I've lived in 50 addresses since. One man I know came to New York to see me, and he was not a man whom we had brought to France. He was the son of a man whom we had brought to France. So that was nice.
Yeah. Yes, Kelly.
When they burned books in the beginning, do you think they burned books because they were afraid that people would get knowledge, and then they'd know, and then they could do something to damage their way of having them go on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Callie's asking when they burned books at the beginning, when the Nazis first came into power in Germany. What do you think their motive was? Why were they burning books? Were they afraid of the ideas that were in the books, or were they afraid that they would challenge their authority?
Yeah,
basically, why were they burning books?
Well, because the first thing dictators always fear are the intellectuals, are the people who think, are the writers. And of course, behind each book is a writer. They fear that mostly because in books you can find ideas which are very different from the dictator's idea. And so anyone who was against Hitler and the Third Reich, Third
Reich, yeah.
Third Reich, anyone who was against it was an enemy of the state. And especially if they had Jewish names, they would, I mean, whatever was in their eyes the enemy, they would burn the books. But then again, so many, and they didn't allow certain music because it was written by Jews. Now, it's crazy to think about it, but this is what happened. It's very unreal, these things.
Certainly, they didn't want people to think for themselves. That was the first thing that they wanted to stop. They wanted to make sure that everybody was towing the line at the same kind of thought, of the same support for the system that they had. So everybody was all collectively, into one frame of mind. That's the way they can control people. When you think for yourself, it's scary to the authorities. So that's why I encourage it highly, folks. Anyway, who's next? Yes.
I was wondering why you came to America after the war.
That happened in '56. You might, you might not even have been born. You were not born then. But in Hungary, you know, the country in the Balkan, next to Austria, they had the Russians had occupied it, and in 1956 there was a revolt. The people stood up against the Russians, and the Russians smashed that revolt with the tanks in the streets, and they shot thousands of people. And we, my wife and I, really thought it's gonna start all over again. So we wanted to leave Europe. It didn't start all over again, but that we didn't know then. I applied for American citizenship and American immigration papers, which was very difficult to get then because all these countries had quota. They only allowed so many Belgians, so many Italians, so many Spaniards, so many Englishmen into this country here. And the quota for the Dutch was already filled for years and years to come. So, but again, I was lucky. I knew the president of the American Institute of Architects, and he knew me and my work, and he wrote letters in my behalf that we would be an asset to the America, and we became non-quota immigrants. That they allowed. If the Americans thought that you could help them here, that they allowed.
Let's see. How about you?
Do you know if there are remains of the Atlantic Wall still standing?
There are. As a matter of fact, I saw on one of these shows recently. I saw a Discovery Channel or one of they have a segment called The Atlantic Wall, and they showed how it was built. They recognized me in that show too, because they've inserted it since then that I used the Atlantic Wall as a pretext to get people out of Holland. They try to blow up most of it, but certain things are too close to communities and too big that they just let them rot away. They will be there for the next 20,000 years, I guess. Mm. See, the Germans not only built new fortresses, but sometimes when there were the hotels or villas situated next to the shoreline, they used the house as a mold. They just poured concrete in it, and so it still looks like a house, but it was a bunch of concrete with cannons sticking out.
Next. Yes, how about you?
Would you ever consider going back to your original home?
To my old home?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. My wife and I used to go back once or twice a year, but lately my wife is not, she's became an invalid, and it's hard for her to travel. So in the past 3.5 years I haven't been back. But the houses are still there.
Still looks like Amsterdam. I was just there last week. Let's see. How about you?
Did anyone ever betray you or something?
That's a good question.
Well, that's why I was arrested. A man, actually he was an ice cream vendor at the corner of the street. We always bought ice cream from him, and he was arrested. And what they always liked to know, the Germans, was with whom did you work? Who are you helpers? And he told them that he had given me identification papers, real ones, which we then changed, which was true. The only thing was he shouldn't have done it, but I don't know what methods they used to get that information out of him. That's why they arrested me. But so that was a kind of betrayal. But you can never really tell people that is a bad thing, considering the methods they used to get that information out of you. If you were, they might be beyond torture, which they did too. They might have said, you have an hour to tell us what we want to know, or else we're gonna kill your wife, or we're gonna kill your kids. I mean, so you cannot blame anyone for what we now call betrayals.
Well, let's see. How about you?
What did you think was the scariest part of your whole journey in saving the Jews?
Well, as I explained a minute ago, that night in the middle of the winter, I think that was the closest we got by being alive.
Well, certainly, probably when you were being shot at by the Brits too. I imagine would have been a pretty scary.
Yeah, but that is kind of. I mean, that's. When we leave now, we might get into a car accident. These things you take for granted, right?
It's just part of.
That's part of life. But.
Let's see. Who have I not called on? How about you in the back there? Yes.
Were the Jews always killed when they got caught? Did they ever just throw them did they lock them up, or did they always just kill them?
That's what they did in the beginning. They see, the Germans had a very vicious game. They let what they called the Jewish Council. They let the Jews decide which Jew had to be sent to a camp, or finally to Auschwitz. So it was not them, it was the Jews themselves who did it, which was, of course, a terrible thing. And the people who were part of that Jewish council, they were trying to save themselves. I mean, they rather let someone else go. The Germans only had to say, next Monday we need 1,200 Jews. And they were then sent to a camp in Holland from which the trains would depart, I forget, every Tuesday night, I believe, to Auschwitz. You know, you must have seen pictures of these freight trains with barbed wire around it. And a lot of people never made it, because if you're stuck in a cattle wagon without food or drink for 3 days and 2 nights, a lot of people die already on the way. Old people don't make it, and very small ones don't make it either. And they took, of course, everyone. They took them from whether women were pregnant or had a baby of 2 weeks, or whether a Jew was 98 years old, they couldn't care less. They wanted to take the Jews out of this world, and they succeeded quite well in that. After all, 6 million people were killed, 6 million Jews, and 6 million is an awful lot of people. I mean,
you know what I always wondered about when I was your age was, how was it possible? How could they get away with killing 6 million people? And in doing the research for this book and kind of understanding the Nazis' methodology, I realized that they were very good at what they did. They used deception a lot and betrayal, basically saying one thing and getting people to kind of go along with them, basically saying, you know, if you just do this, nobody will get hurt. Or maybe we'll take them, but we won't take you. So they played, it was a psychological game. They played on people's kind of tendency to just kind of want to go along with what they're told to do. Play it safe, don't rock the boat, don't question authority. They first made everybody feel weak and helpless, and then said, if you just go along with us, we'll do that. And that way, they could just very quietly funnel everybody toward this final end that so many of them unfortunately met. That's what's so amazing, that was the whole environment. Everybody was in that frame of mind, and that's what's kind of remarkable, that there were people like Jaap who just refused to go along with it. And as you always say, you were not the only one. There was many great people in the Dutch underground who were doing what they could. But still, it's kind of amazing to think of what it's like to have to take that on yourself, to think for yourself without the government telling you what's the right thing to do, your community, nobody else around you kind of supporting you. You're really having to act on yourself, your own sense of morality from within, and your own guts, your own instinct to do actually something about it. Not an easy place.
It was always, of course, not only the Germans who took the Jews away, because you have to realize that of all these millions of people, they lived in houses. And all these houses all of a sudden became empty and were taken over by the neighbors. So there was it was quite an incentive for people to say, to go to the Germans to say, there are Jews living next door. And they were rounded up and taken away because they wanted that house. So there was always a lot of betrayal going on beyond what the Nazis did.
Yes?
Did anybody you bring to Paris betray you or run away?
No, we were very, very lucky with that. As I said, it sometimes was difficult. Sometimes we were afraid, but that something would happen, but it never happened. No one ever betrayed us. We took all kind of precautions, but you can only do so much. You never know what will happen the next moment.
Yeah, it's amazing that none of the boys, they were all just boys too, they were all just like teenagers, 16, 17-year-old.
Yeah.
None of them messed up their story. Whenever they had to cross lines, they were questioned. You know, when people came around to see their papers, they all stuck with their story and knew exactly what to say and how to conduct themselves. So there was actually a lot of heroes when you think about it. All the people who managed to get out and go along with the whole plot were also quite heroic in their own way.
Yeah.
How about you? Go ahead. Do you have a question?
Yeah. How come you couldn't just go into a store and buy what you needed? Like, you couldn't just go into a grocery store and buy the food you needed?
Well, first of all, the government decided, the government gave us cards with coupons on it. And in the newspaper, which was, by the way, these were the German-controlled newspapers, so there was only one. And there was no radio, there was no television, so the newspaper was the only thing which had government information. And that would say, as of next Monday, on coupon number 69, you can get half a pound of flour. So with that, you went to the store and you gave her the coupon, and you were allowed to buy half a pound of flour. So everything, the stores were empty. You couldn't walk past shelves. There was nothing. Only when you came with the coupons would they give you what you were entitled to, which at the end of the war was so little. We got 1.5 kilograms, which is about 3 pounds, American pounds, of a sugar beet, which is a big beet, which is usually given to cattle as cattle fodder. With that, we got, I forget the amount, a few potatoes, and a piece of bread about this long for a week, a person. So it's not too... in Amsterdam alone, 2,000 people died every week. And they couldn't even be buried because no one could afford to spend energy on burying other people, so they were lying in the streets and rotted away. It's hard to, when I think back, it's hard to imagine that the situation of these times.
In Holland, it's still known as the Hunger Winter, when people were starving to death. It was after the Allies had landed in D-Day and they were making their way toward Germany, but they got stopped at a big river, and the Germans had dug in. And so the southern part of Holland was liberated, but the northern part was still behind enemy lines. And the Germans had taken everything, every scrap of food, even the topsoil, as Jaap said, every single thing. And so the people of Holland were starving to death. They were eating tulip bulbs, anything they could to possibly keep alive. So we really don't know what it's like to have those kind of conditions in this country. We've been so lucky that we've been spared that so far. So it's always a point that I like to make, that we really appreciate what we have here and what our freedom has given us. Now, you had a question, this young man right here in purple.
After the World War II, were you involved in any other wars or movements?
No. I was involved in the rehabilitating of a French village as an architect. I rebuilt a few farmhouses there, but I was never involved in any illegal situation.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, who have I not called on yet? Yes, sir, how about you?
How old were you when you started bringing Jews to England?
I was born in 1918, so I was 21 and 22 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
It all happened.
In the book on page 39, I think, there's the ark. And you drew it so it has two red flags on it, and then the ark, and then there's like a little black part right over the ark. Did you draw that so it kind of looks like Hitler?
Yeah, you noticed.
Yeah.
If you can see that on camera. Do you know what ark that is? Anybody can tell her? Yeah?
Arc of Triumph.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly. The Arc de Triomphe, as it's called in French. It's right in the center of Paris. The Arc de Triomphe is to the French people sort of like the way the Statue of Liberty is to us. It's sort of their symbol of nationality, of who they are as a people. And so for the Germans to come in and put Nazi flags on it is basically saying, we own you now, we're on top of you. So that's essentially what I was showing. But you caught what I was doing underneath with the image. I wanted to make it look more or less like Hitler's face there, subtly, just so that some people saw it. Anyway, wrapping up here, what else would you like to say? You always have a last few words, and so do I.
Well, the poem line?
The poem, or about being a bystander?
Yeah, that is one thing I would really like you to know and act. Don't be bystanders. This will not happen again, but similar things will happen. Things which make you being part of a bad situation, and you can shrug it off and walk away from it and say, well, it doesn't concern me, but it should concern you, and you should try to do whatever you can to change it. In this country, the minorities, and you sitting in a school bus, certain of your friends might gang up to another kid just because his color of his skin is different, or because because you were told he is gay and that you don't want, or they don't want. or he is a Latin, and you say, well, why the hell are they coming here? As if your forebears didn't come here under the same circumstances. You should do something about all these things. You don't have to be a great hero to help minorities or to help people in danger.
Yeah, and I would like to say myself, just building on that, what I've really gotten out of doing this book and what I like to share with all of you about it is to really show how one person can make a difference, how each one of us has the possibility to do something heroic. We all have the possibility of heroism in us, even in a small way, within our lives. We all have that possibility, just as the example of Jaap showed us as a model. He was just an ordinary guy who was called upon to do extraordinary things under these circumstances. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.